Welcome back to BIB 201, Introduction to New Testament Literature. This week we are looking at the third gospel, the Gospel of Luke. The previous 2 weeks we looked at Matthew and Mark. And Matthew's gospel, we sort of looked at the Galilean settings for the life of Jesus and his ministry. And last week we looked at Mark's gospel with a particular focus on the content of his teaching. We looked at parables, we looked at the Son of Man. And for this week, we particularly want to focus our attention on the Passion narrative, the story of the last week in the life of Jesus. That's this distinctive element about Luke's gospel that will be important for us to pay attention to. Where you have a variety of readings this week, and both in terms of textbook and articles. I've given you a variety of articles that sort of highlight elements pertaining to the last week in the life of Jesus. An article on Caiaphas by David Flusser, my article in the Biblical Archaeology Review on Pontius Pilate. These are two central figures in the story of Jesus's questioning, his condemnation to death, and then crucifixion. We also, in your lesson, take some time to look at the event of the cleansing of the temple, as it's popularly called, the event where Jesus comes into the temple precincts and challenges things that are going on there. I particularly wanted you to look at, compare the accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're different. They have different details about them, and usually when people tell the story, if I was to ask you what happened, tell me what you remember, you would probably give me an account that took from each one of those Gospels. There's nothing wrong with that, except one has to be very careful that you don't eclipse the voice of each individual account. So again, we'll look at that a little bit more closely as we get towards the end of our talk today. But we want to talk a little bit of introductory elements regarding the Gospel of Luke. As we looked last week, this week we want to take note of some special characteristics concerning Luke. The author of Luke's Gospel, like the authors of all of our Gospels, is attributed by tradition. We don't have, he doesn't sign his Gospel, he doesn't identify himself explicitly anywhere in the Gospel. The way that generally we arrive at the authorship of the third Gospel, is that the author writes in both the Gospel of Luke and Acts. He writes to the same individual, Theophilus. We'll have something to say about him in just a second, but he addresses both of them to Theophilus, so we assume it's the same author. And in the second half of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 16 through 18, the author begins to include himself in the story. He begins what we call the we sections, where he speaks of himself and Paul. He seems to have accompanied Paul, and so tradition scholars have looked into Paul's writings to see who were the individuals who accompanied him on his journeys, and we find special reference given to Luke in Colossians, 2 Timothy, and Philemon. So on the basis of that, the authorship of Luke for the book of Acts was posited, and building upon that, and it extended also to the gospel itself. He writes in both works to an individual he calls Theophilus. There is some discussion about whether that's an ideal figure, just a made-up figure. His name means beloved of God, or whether in fact there is someone named Theophilus. It's interesting that we do have in the 50s of the first century. We have a priest, high priest by the name of Theophilus, who's mentioned by Josephus in Antiquities. So some have suggested that perhaps these works were written with him in mind, that they were written in a sense to um, defend the integrity of the gospel and the early church by arguing that they were not out to break the law, that Jesus wasn't about to destroy the law, that his early followers were not abandoning the law, the Torah, because one of the elements that you find within Luke and Acts is that Jesus is presented as being Torah observant, law observant, and so are his followers. So there's some suggestion that perhaps these works were written as an apologetic in defense of the gospel, defense of the early church, and that these are penned by an individual named Luke. We don't know much about him. There is some suggestion that perhaps he doesn't seem to be Jewish, but perhaps he was a God-fearer, someone who was a semi-proselyte who'd been drawn to the Jewish faith, elements of the Jewish faith, and then found his way to become a follower of Jesus. The style of his writing is his own personal style is quite refined. The first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel, as well as the second half of Acts, the portion where I mentioned that the author himself becomes part of the story. The Greek of those sections is very refined and quite different from the style of the Greek in most of the Gospel in the first half of Acts. That may be because Luke is relying upon sources. He's using eyewitnesses, he's using written accounts and incorporating those in the writing of his works, and there seems to be a distinctive shift in style. Luke actually gives us, oftentimes you'll hear Luke sort of dismissed, sometimes in scholarship dismissed for his historical value. I would view it quite differently. I think Luke has some unique witnesses, things that we don't get any other place, in any other gospel, in any other work in the New Testament, and even in some instances, nowhere else in the landscape of Jewish history, literature of the period. He gives us the first records of the first reports of Jewish customs and practice that sometimes we don't hear about for centuries afterwards. The mentioning of John the Baptist and Jesus being named at their circumcision on the 8th day is the first record, the first account of that custom that is universally practiced by every Jewish family. But it's not a practice in the Old Testament. We have no mention of the naming of the son on the 8th day in the Old Testament. That seems to be a practice that develops after the Old Testament period. And again, the first written record that we have of that is John the Baptist, and then also Jesus. We have the account in Luke 4 of Jesus preaching in the synagogue in Nazareth and standing to read from the prophets, from Isaiah. That practice of reading of the prophets together with the Torah, the Pentateuch, is something that is universally practiced in every Jewish synagogue on the Sabbath. But the first account that we have, the first report of the reading of the Haftarah, the reading of the prophets, together with the Pentateuch, is in Luke's Gospel. And finally, in the book of Acts, we hear the reference to a Sabbath day journey. Today, Orthodox Jews on the Sabbath are limited in how far they can go from their town, their village, the limits of their city, and that limit of a Sabbath day journey, which amounts to about a kilometer, they can go out of the city borders about a kilometer. That is first heard in the book of Acts. So Luke has access to some very interesting witnesses regarding Jewish life and faith in the days of the Second Temple. He does parallel much of the material in Mark and Matthew. He has some distinctive differences in his presentations of the story. He differs at points, particularly in the account of the Passion narrative, Jesus' last week in Jerusalem. Luke seems to take that story in a different direction. The way that he lays it out, the particular details, the questions of who are the friends and foes of Jesus, the motivation on the part of the enemies of Jesus to do what they've done, what they did. These things are different in Luke's gospel, and I think it's important to pay attention to those independent details. They tell us that Luke is getting his information from someplace else. In spite of New Testament scholarship's assumption that Luke is relying upon Mark for the bulk of his gospel, even New Testament scholarship acknowledges that when it comes to the Passion narratives, to the last week of the life of Jesus, it seems that Luke has another source. You cannot explain what Luke has based on the assumption that, well, he's just relying upon Mark for his material. So we want to spend a little bit of time in looking at that phenomenon of his report of the last week of the life of Jesus. We're limited in our time and how much we can focus on this, but we do want to look at it briefly and just sort of hit the high points. He opens, interestingly enough, after the first two chapters, he has the birth narrative and then the early life of Jesus. As he opens up into the third chapter, he sort of writes like a classical historian. He sets the historical context for the events that are about to happen, who's ruling, who's in positions of power. It reflects the days following the death of Herod the Great. Herod, of course, that particular Herod, sometimes the gospel writers just make reference to Herod and they assume you know which one you're talking about. This is a family name. We speak of Herod Antipas, Herod Philip. When Herod the Great, again, the one who was ruling at the time Jesus was born, and the killing of the whole story of the killing of the innocents in Bethlehem, when he dies, his kingdom is divided up into three sections: Samaria and Judea in the south, then in the north, Galilee and the Transjordan area, the Transjordan called Perea, where there was a large Jewish population. His oldest son, Archelaus, inherited responsibility to rule Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. Galilee and Perea fell to Herod Antipas. He's the Herod who's responsible for the death of John the Baptist. Jesus refers to him as the fox. In the north and east of the country, the area right up to Pania, Caesarea Philippi, all the way down to the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. This is the domain, the tetrarchy, the region of Herod Philip. So those three sons inherit their father's kingdom. None of them ever became king. They wanted to be king, but they did not succeed in that desire, and so they ruled briefly for a while, but and pretty much in the as we encountered Jesus in the opening of the gospel, there's been a change. Herod Archelaus, who ruled in the south, he really wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and to inherit the throne and the crown of his father. So after 10 years in 6 AD, he traveled to Rome and appealed to the Senate to be given the position of his father as king. He was followed by a delegation of Samaritans and Jews who essentially said, we would prefer not to have him. In fact, we would prefer that you would rule us directly. they continued to use this man. So Rome accepted that offer, and they sent Archelaus into exile. And from that point on, they began to rule directly in the southern part of the country, in Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. And this is where we get the series of governors, prefects, procurators, the most famous of which is Pontius Pilate. Uh, Herod Antipas continues to rule in the north during during the extent of our gospel, as well as Herod Philip. Herod Antipas is deposed in the middle of the 30s, but this is after the time of Jesus, and he is after sort of the death and resurrection of Jesus. He is deposed and sent away, and then Rome once again rules that area directly in the north and in the Transjordan. So this is the political situation that Luke describes in the opening of chapter 3. He also mentions Annas and Caiaphas as well. So he sort of sets the religious and political stage for Jesus' beginning of his ministry. Again, for this week, we want to focus on Jesus's last week in Jerusalem, his last week of his life. We began to hear in Luke 9:51 that he sets his face to go to Jerusalem. We have this long travel narrative through almost 8 chapters where we have, and it's probably not all in chronological order. It seems to be a collection of sayings and deeds that are sort of put together in this travelogue. But we have Jesus attempting to get coming up through the hill country of Samaria. He is rejected by a Samaritan village. They do not want him to use their village as a byway going up to Jerusalem, giving honor, credence to the temple in Jerusalem, because the Samaritans believed that Gerizim was the place that God chose to reveal himself, not in Jerusalem. So there's a bit of a obstacle there coming up through Samaria. So next thing we know, we hear Jesus at Jericho, which assumes that he comes up the eastern side of the Jordan. One does not come on pilgrimage on the west side of the Jordan because there are limited water resources, but there are a lot of springs on the eastern bank. And as I mentioned, there's a heavy Jewish population. So we have Jesus crossing over at some point up north and then coming back to the western side of the Jordan at Jericho. From Jericho, of course, he encounters the blind beggar Bartimaeus. He has the healing there, and then he continues up to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, he stays with Martha and Mary on the eastern slopes of the Mount of Olives, just a bit to the east of Jerusalem, not far. He seems to stay there and go in and out of the city as he goes in to teach and participate in the temple area. But he stays again on the backside of the Mount of Olives, in area of Bethany and Bethpage. So this is more or less Jesus' pilgrimage coming up to Jerusalem for Passover, which, of course, as we read in Luke chapter 2, is a practice he grew up experiencing. His family brought him every year to Jerusalem for Passover, so that becomes part of the rhythm of his life. When he comes to Jerusalem, he challenges practices that are going on in the temple. I think this is very important because this becomes a pivotal point in Luke's narrative. It's only from this event do we hear of anyone plotting to do away with Jesus, to kill him. It's not exactly the same presentation as we find in Mark and Matthew, but again, in Luke's storyline, the cleansing of the temple becomes pivotal, central to the events as they're going to unfold. Whatever Jesus is doing here inflames the opposition of his enemies, and it's out of this event, for the very first time we hear in Luke's gospel, that someone is going to attempt to kill him. do away with him. Again, we read in Luke 19, and I've given you this as well. This to look at not only in Luke's gospel but also Mark and Matthew, the idea of Jesus going into the temple and driving out those who sold. Again, it's slightly different in the other gospels, and it's a very succinct, short account. We have no mention of the turning over of tables. We have no mention of the money changers. We have no mention of the ropes, which we find actually in John's account. John, of course, has a cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, not at the end like we have at the Synoptics. But the presentation is slightly different in Luke's gospel, and we have him instead of, if you want to say it like this, instead of using violence, he actually expels the individuals there by using scripture, and he quotes two passages. He combines them together in that very familiar fashion of taking two halves of verses and putting them together. He says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer," drawn from Isaiah 56:7, and then he finishes with a quotation from Jeremiah 7:11. "But you have made it a den of thieves, a den of robbers." And this is a theme that Jesus picks up and repeats again and again during this week. If you want to think of the parable of the wicked husbandman in the next chapter, where those who are entrusted with the lands of the landowner, and they raise the crops, and it comes time for him asking for his portion, they refuse to give it to him, so they are robbing from him what is due to him. Again, we have a couple of other episodes as well that revolve around the idea of thievery, of robbery. So the question is raised, what is Jesus upset about? And who is he targeting this rebuke for? It seems that it is those who have their power based in the temple authorities, the high priests, the Sadducees. They are the ones who seem to have felt most threatened by Jesus. When we get to the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus, the capture, the bringing to Pontius Pilate, and the whole death account, what most people don't notice is that the Pharisees are not mentioned in that. We always sort of present them as being the great enemies of Jesus, but when it comes to actually doing the deed of seeing Jesus brought to an end, they're nowhere to be found. Instead, it seems to be the high priests, the aristocracy of his day, those who were, let's just say, were not suffering under the occupation by the Romans. Instead, they were getting quite wealthy. And we hear criticisms of them in the Jewish sources of things that they did. They held the money to themselves. They didn't share with other priests as they were supposed to. They were supposed to distribute temple funds to the other priests. They did not do that, and priests starved to death. We also hear that they used the condition that's laid out in the Old Testament regarding the priests did not have to give tithes. All the tribes gave tithes except for the Levites, the priests, because they had no land, they had no produce, they had nothing to tithe with. Instead, they were recipients of the tithes. But that situation changes, that setting changes in the Hellenistic and Roman periods as we began to hear about priests owning large tracts of land and accumulating fabulous wealth. So that when the Romans came and they continued to use the loophole and refused to tithe on the produce of their lands. So that when the Romans came and destroyed their lands, the people said, "See, this is God's punishment upon you because you robbed him, you stole from him." So we hear from the Jewish sources again the accusation of thievery, of robbery, something that we hear again and again Jesus hammering away on in that last week. And it seems that this becomes the tipping point. In the closing of that story of the cleansing of the temple, we hear that they decide to destroy him. This is the first time in Luke's gospel anyone sets out to destroy him. But at the same time, we hear another uh, echo, a refrain that is repeated again and again and again in the Passion narratives. They could do nothing because the people hung on his words. In other words, these are not, it's not suggesting that all the people are his followers or believers, but Jesus is giving voice to their critique, and he's advancing their criticism of this priestly aristocracy, which is becoming wealthy uh, off of the Roman occupation. Again, he combines together Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11. As always, I encourage you to stop, open up the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and read the passages that are cited. Very often, the message that is intended is not in the actual words that are stated or cited. Uh, Sometimes they're just intended to point you to a larger passage of Scripture, and that's what we have, I think, going on here. If you look at the larger context of Jeremiah on this occasion, interestingly enough, it's Jeremiah in the temple precincts, just like Jesus is. And he's accusing them of being confident in themselves that even though they're doing things that are wrong, because they have the temple, they're safe. They can continue to live in their sinful ways. And the message of Jeremiah to his contemporaries, uh, again, this is the Lord speaking through Jeremiah, reminds them, don't think that you're safe. Go look and see what I did to my people at Shiloh. And of course, if you, he's referring back to the account of 1 Samuel 4:6, where the people go into battle, take the Ark of the Covenant into battle, and they lose that. The priests are wiped out. They lose the element that signifies God's presence in among his people. And so Jeremiah, by referencing back to this episode in 1 Samuel chapters 4-6, it's a warning of that they may lose God's dwelling place, the place that God dwells, in this instance, the temple, and it is a scathing warning against the priest. By Jesus, in sort of a daisy chain fashion, referring back to Jeremiah, who's referring back to 1 Samuel 4-6, Jesus sort of updates that message, that warning, to his own contemporaries, to the priests in his own day, that if they're not careful, they may find themselves receiving the punishment of God. And this is a central event, this cleansing of the temple and what happens subsequently. Again, if we had more time, we could go through and unpack some of the things that Jesus is saying, where he keeps coming back to this theme of thievery, of robbery, that they're stealing from God and that it will have consequences. But this challenge eventually is precipitated by Jesus' arrest. We get this in the closing chapters of Luke's Gospel, chapters 22 and 23. We open with the presentation of the Passover, the Last Supper. Remember that I told you that Jesus is staying at Bethany with Martha and Mary and Lazarus, but when it comes time to the Passover, he has to come into Jerusalem. It's required to eat the Passover meal within the walled city of Jerusalem. This is what he does. He comes to eat the meal that's been prepared, and then they'll return out of the city. Space was a premium, but it was requirement to eat the Passover lamb within the walls of the city. One of the things that's different about Passover now, as contrasted with then, is that in those days, the main course for the meal was actually the lamb. The lamb was taken up, the paschal lamb was taken up to the temple. It's the one sacrifice that's not done by the priests, it's done by the community, by the people. 10 men would take this lamb, they would sacrifice it, give a portion, leave a portion for the temple, but the most of it will be taken back and cooked, barbecued in a sense, and it's the main course. So that when Jesus looks at the meal and in Luke 22 and says, I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you, It's not just talking about a holiday like Thanksgiving. He's actually talking about the main course and what it signifies. Because in Hebrew, the word Pesach, which is represented in Greek Pascha, it is the same word for the holiday, for Passover holiday, and the sacrificial victim, the lamb. And we can hear Paul use that in his own writings when he says, Christ, our Pascha, our Passover, has been sacrificed. On that occasion, he refers to the lamb. And I think Jesus also, when he makes the statement, I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover, this Pesach with you. So when they finish the meal, they go out of the city. They probably camped someplace on the slopes of the Mount of Olives because it was um, too crowded in the city, but they couldn't go home. They couldn't go all the way because of the limits of what one could journey on the Sabbath or a holiday, the same restrictions. So they camp out on the Mount of Olives, and they are there when Judas Iscariot leads the temple authorities and their soldiers to uh, to arrest Jesus, and he doesn't bring them to identify who Jesus is. They know who Jesus is, but he brings them to identify where Jesus is camping, where he's staying on the slopes. There were doubtless thousands of individuals. Josephus describes tens of thousands of pilgrims camping out surrounding Jerusalem. There wasn't room in the holy city. And Jesus doing likewise. He's up there. He's not alone. There are other people up on the Mount of Olives, but they come, they arrest him, and and of course Jesus drives home the fact that what they're doing does not have popular support by saying, why have you come with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you didn't dare lay a hand on me. This is his way of saying what you're doing, you have to do out of the public eye. You have to do it under the cloak of darkness while everybody is sleeping. You have to do what you're doing because you know the people do not support you in this. In any event, they arrest him. They bring him back to the house of the high priest, to Caiaphas's house. They keep him there overnight. According to Luke's chronology, in the morning, early in the morning, they bring him for questioning. Again, I would assume this is a smaller group. There's no mention in Luke's gospel of the full Sanhedrin, but a small group of individuals who are attached to the Temple Mount priests, and they began to question Jesus. Sort of, what is your end game? What are you about? Are you just trying to stir up a little trouble, or do you have something larger that you're trying to accomplish? And when they sense that he has a high self-awareness, he has goals and things that could be danger to them, they realize they don't have any choice but to take him to Pontius Pilate. Now, Caiaphas, the high priest, rules from 18 AD to 36. He rules for 18 years. He's the longest rule of a high priest in the Second Temple period. What's interesting is that he rules exactly the same length of time as Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate becomes the Roman governor, the prefect, in 18, and he rules until 36. Both Caiaphas and Pontius Pilate are deposed. They are removed from power by the Romans because of their abuse of power. And I think it's more than a coincidence that their time of their rule is so closely aligned. I think that there was collusion that went on here. I think we have episodes that we read about in Josephus things that Pontius Pilate did, but I think that Caiaphas, at a minimum, does not object, does not say anything. Pontius Pilate, on one occasion, is described coming in and pilfering the temple treasury for the building of an aqueduct, and he particularly uses funds that had been set aside were sanctified, were holy funds that were used for the sacrifices. And so they were, no one could use them, but Pontius Pilate came in and took them. And there was a riot that broke out with a great loss of life. What's interesting is that we don't hear a word of objection, anything from the high priest, from Caiaphas, or any of them. So it seems in very real ways that perhaps they're in his pocket. They're getting wealthy off of the occupation. They're the aristocracy of the city. So they question Jesus, trying to figure out what his intentions are. When they sense that they need to bring him to Pilate, they bring him in Luke 23 on charges of political charges. 3 charges are brought in Luke 23, verses 1 and 2. He's stirring up people from Galilee to hear. He's telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be a king, Christ a king. So they bring to him, to Pontius Pilate, 3 political charges. Any question of blasphemy, Pilate wouldn't care about. He would have no interest in. He would be interested in questions of political issues that Jesus might pose as a threat to the Roman Empire. In any event, they bring him to Pontius Pilate. Pilate questions him. One of the unique parts of Luke's report is that when Pontius Pilate hears that Jesus came from Galilee, he realizes he's a resident in Galilee. Therefore, he falls under the jurisdiction of the region of Galilee, and the governor there, the ruler, the tetrarch, is none other than Herod Antipas, the man who executed John the Baptist. And so he sends him to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas questions him. Jesus refuses to respond, and Antipas doesn't think he's much of a threat, so he sort of mockingly dresses him up in royal attire and sends him back to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate got a bit of a kick out of it, and so he's going to punish him and release him. But the temple authorities, who again have more of a vested interest in the outcome of all this and feel particularly threatened by Jesus and his words, his teaching, they press Pontius Pilate to the point that Pilate condemns him to death. He's taken from there, and you'll see on the map that we have him going and coming the area of Herod the Great's palace, where Herod the Great used to live before he died. He had a number of palaces, but it seems that the Roman governors they adopted those royal estates when they came to power. They were the supreme rulers of the land, and so they obtained these properties and they lived there. And so it seems that that when we're talking about where Pontius Pilate is, he likely is in the area of Herod's palace, near today's Jaffa Gate, and he's inherited these properties, and this is where Jesus is brought. Pontius Pilate again questions him, sends him to Antipas. Antipas sends him back, and then he condemns Jesus to death, and he's taken probably to the area of what is today the Holy Sepulchre, the area of Golgotha, Calvary, just outside of the city walls. In the first century, not today. Today they're inside of the city walls, but the city walls today are not the same as they were in the first century. And so we have this sort of scenario playing out here of Jesus being led out of the city and crucified and buried nearby. The Luke's gospel ends with this unique story of the encounter on the road to Emmaus. This is 2 who are leaving Jerusalem, and they have heard the terrible news of the death of Jesus. And as they're going away, Jesus encounters them on the road and sort of butts into a private conversation and you have this exchange. It's very interesting, sort of the scenario there. When they get to a way station in the evening, they settle in and they begin to have uh, dinner, food, and in the breaking of the bread, the blessing that's said over the bread, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. When he does that, they recognize who he is, and then he is no longer with them. He disappears, and so they return to Jerusalem. And this is part of the reports of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. But this particular account is unique to Luke's gospel. So, as you're reading this week, you're looking over the elements again from reading the brief introduction in the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Pay particular attention to those characteristic elements of pertaining to Luke's gospel. The articles, I think you'll enjoy. They're short articles on Pontius Pilate, sadist or saint. Sometimes people don't realize that there are actually certain parts of the church who have declared Pontius Pilate a saint, which I find very difficult because Pontius Pilate is the man single most responsible historically for the death of Jesus. Only he had the power to crucify anyone. And so it's sort of an interesting thing that the followers of Jesus in certain parts of the church have actually made him into a saint. So I in this article of the Biblical Archaeology Review, I was asked to look at the figure of Pontius Pilate in light of modern archaeology. There's also this article by Flusser on Caiaphas. It coincided with the discovery of Caiaphas's family tomb. 1990, an excavation south of Jerusalem, they came across a family tomb. They opened it up, and there was an inscription on one of the ossuaries, sort of a burial box where you put the remains after the flesh is decayed. And it had been inscribed Yosef Bar Kepha, which is his name. His first name was Joseph, and his family name was Caiaphas. But they actually found the ossuary of Caiaphas. It's the oldest ossuary of a known individual that we know who they were. And so the ossuary of Caiaphas sort of gave rise to some discussion about him, and David Flusser wrote a character sketch about the figure of Caiaphas. You also have a discussion question on the cleansing of the temple, which we've talked about a little bit just now, sort of looking particularly at comparisons in the accounts, just highlighting the differences between them, just taking note that not all the Gospels read exactly the same. And then, of course, you'll have the weekly test that ends the midnight, the night before class. So both your discussion post and your test need to be done by then. The test, as you remember, has a 24-hour window. It begins 12 o'clock midnight and then finishes that night in the day before class at 11:59. So enjoy your reading of Luke's Gospel and considering some of the topics that we have brought up, and look forward to being with you next week.